hands of Jesus in the garden where he prayed. They led him through the streets with shame. They spat upon the Savior, so pure and free from sin. They said, crucify him, he's to blame. When they nailed him to the cross, his mother stood nearby. He said, woman, behold thy son. He cried, I thirst for water, but they gave him none to drink. Then the sinful work of man was done. To the howling mob he yielded. He did not for mercy cry. The cross of shame he took alone. And when he cried, it's finished, he gave himself to die. Salvation's wondrous plan was done. In the grave he lay, Jesus my Savior, waiting the coming day. Jesus my Lord. Vainly they watch his bed. Jesus my Savior. Vainly they seal the dead. Jesus my Lord.
Very simple question that we can ask is, who believed that Jesus would be raised from the dead that Sunday morning 2,000 years ago? And if you've got a copy of the Journey, you'll see on the front of it this question and some blanks there. And I'd love for you to fill in those blanks if you would, because I just want to get this point across, because it's such an important point. And the answer to the question, who believed that Jesus would be raised from the dead, is very simple. No one. No one. No one but the one who was dead, Jesus Christ. I want you to think about that for a moment. The significance of that statement. Mary Magdalene got up early that Sunday morning. Mary and another friend named Mary and a lady by the name of Salome, and they started working before the sun ever began to tint the skies in the east. And what they were doing is they were preparing spices. Spices that in just a few moments, as the sun would start peeking over the horizon, they would take these spices and they were going to a garden tomb. But they weren't going there because there was going to be a resurrection. They were going there because the one they had been following had died. Mary had followed Jesus for literally maybe months, maybe even a couple of years. And Mary that Sunday morning was like the rest of the disciples. I mean, two of the disciples that day was talking to a stranger, and as they were talking about what had happened the previous 2 or 3 days, they said, but we had hoped. We we had hoped. Look at the past tense of the verb up there. Not we are hoping, we had hoped. And so when Mary went to the tomb that morning and carried those spices, she had no idea whatsoever what was going to happen that day. But you know, Mary wasn't the only one. The apostles. Where were the apostles that first day of the week 2,000 years ago? You know where they were? They were in a room with the door locked, fearing for their very lives. I mean, they had watched Jesus die. They had been there in the garden when he had been arrested. Peter and John specifically had followed and watched him as he was tried, as he was finally put to death. John had witnessed the whole thing standing there in front of the cross. And so when Sunday came, what were the apostles thinking? The apostles were thinking two things. We had hoped, and I hope the authorities don't find us. And so they were cowering behind a room with the doors locked because they were scared to death for their lives. What about the Jewish leadership? What was their concern that Sunday morning? It wasn't about a Messiah being resurrected from the dead, I promise you. Pilate got up that morning and he ate a meal like he had without any fear whatsoever about what was fixing to come. The high priest, Passover was over, it was a good week, and he got rid of that troublemaker from Galilee. Herod the Tetrarch, glad to be in Jerusalem, ready to get back to Galilee. All the people who the week earlier had welcomed Jesus into the city as the Son of David, as the King of Israel, it was time to go back to work. In fact, the text tells us that just prior to Saturday, that the religious leaders had gone to Pilate. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver said, after 3 days I'll rise again. So give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Why? What's going on in the religious leader's mind? Several things. For one, they remembered Jesus' claim. If you'll look there on the front of the journey, you'll see a blank there, and it's a very important blank. They knew what Jesus claimed was fixing to take place. They didn't believe it. Didn't believe it for 1 second. But they were fearful of what just might happen. You see, one of the amazing things about Jesus is Jesus had not kept secret about what he was planning on doing. You go back in the book of Matthew, you go back to chapter 12, and you look at Jesus as he's preaching to the crowd. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Do you understand what I'm saying? Jesus said. Jesus had carried the apostles up to a region called Caesarea Philippi. It was about halfway through his 3-year ministry, and he says, I need to tell you something. And Matthew, in order to get across the significance of this, look at how this verse begins. From that time on. He didn't tell them once. He didn't say, by the way, there's something big coming down about 18 months from now. The text says that from that day on, he said, guys, you need to understand what's fixing to happen. I'm going to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law. You know what? Peter believed it. John believed it. They were hoping otherwise, but they believed it. And he said, and I've got to be killed. Now, at the time, they didn't believe that. Peter actually rebuked Jesus, saying, Lord, you got this messiahship down the wrong way. But still, Jesus said, I'm going to be killed. And you know what? On that Sunday morning, they believed it. They had watched it with their own eyes. But then he had told them over and over again, and on the third day, I'm going to be raised to life. And that Sunday morning, if you'd asked Peter, Peter would say, dead people don't come back to life. You'd ask John, John'd say, it's over. I don't know what we're going to do. Matthew, I guess I'll go back to being a tax collector. Boy, we had hoped. We had hoped. But our hope is no more. Not only did the religious leaders know of Jesus' claim, but Jesus had actually told them, point blank. I mean, you turn over to John 2, and Jesus literally is in the temple courts, and he's saying, destroy this temple. And of course, at first, they thought he was talking about that temple that Herod had built. But later on, they understood what he was talking about. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. Even the religious leaders knew of what Jesus had said would take place. But they, like all the rest, said, not going to happen. And so what did they do? They wanted to make sure that the tomb was secure. They said to Pilate, listen, this deceiver, I love the word that they used there, this deceiver said after 3 days he would raise again. And the last thing we need is his disciples to come in and to steal the body, and all at once they'll tell everybody he's been raised from the dead, and the end will be worse than the beginning. So can we secure the tomb? And Pilate said, absolutely. And so they went out to the tomb. And man, what the Bible says they did was they took a seal and they sealed the side of the rock that led into the tomb. Now you say, what was a seal? A seal was like yellow caution tape. It was like police tape that says, do not cross. I mean, a seal would have been a piece of clay that they would have taken, and they would have pressed it in between the rock and the side of the tomb door there. And then they would have taken a ring which represented authority. And they would have pressed that ring into that soft clay. And as it dried, it was a warning to anybody, you break that seal at the risk of your own life. So they went and they made sure the tomb was sealed. But then more than that, I mean, they went, and here's the seal. You go and make it as secure by putting a seal on the tomb. And then number 3, they went, and I evidently just missed it. Oh, there it is. The tomb was secured and guarded by soldiers. In other words, we're not only going to seal it, but we're going to put a watch around it. Now, I wanted Chris and Brian to stand up here dressed like Roman soldiers guarding it. Chris thought a security camera would be better. Okay? So be it. Point being is they wanted to make sure that no one got in that tomb without somebody knowing about it. And so they went, and they posted guards. And by the way, guards understood their responsibility. You see, guards are not like guards today. You have guards, guarding some people working out along the side of the interstate. If one of them gets away, what do? Well, they call in, they notify the authorities, they start a manhunt, but that's about it. I mean, they may be called in and asked, why were you not guarding more carefully? You see, if somebody breaks out of the jail, they'll go and get the guards at the jail, and they'll say, how did this happen? And there'll be an investigation, but most likely they'll keep their jobs. You know what happened in the first century when you failed as a guard? You see, in the book of Acts chapter 12, you have some men who were guarding Peter after he had been arrested. And an angel came in the middle of the night and made sure they stayed nice and asleep. And the angel took them and led Peter outside, and Peter escaped. And the Bible tells us that Herod had a thorough search made for Peter, did not find him, cross-examined the guards, and killed them. You see, when Pilate said, you have a guard, those guards didn't go out to that tomb thinking, oh, great, what a wonderful weekend job we've got. They went out there knowing anything happened, they'd pay with their own lives. And yet, taking all of those precautions, they still didn't for 1 second believe that Jesus would be raised from the dead. You see, in New Testament times, dead people didn't come back to life. I mean, I know it happens all the time in our world today, right? I mean, we hear it all the time. Yeah, he flatlined, but we got him back. Yeah, she quit breathing. We thought she was gone, but the doctors were able to get her back. Of course, that's not what I'm talking about. Dead people don't come back to life. And you know, if you ask people, and Kenny's already mentioned this morning, if you ask people about Jesus Christ, you see, the world will acknowledge several facts about Jesus. Most people in the world will acknowledge there was a man named Jesus of Nazareth. They'll acknowledge it. History tells us he existed. Most people will acknowledge that he was a good man, that he taught good things. Most people, in fact, most historians will acknowledge, you know what? He was executed by Pontius Pilate, governor of Judea, during the early part, somewhere of the early AD 30s. And in addition to that, they buried him. But that's where most people in the world stop. And when you ask them, what about the claims? They'll tell you, well, you know what? Maybe there's another explanation. One of my favorites is this one, and that is, you know, he never died. He never really died. This has been a theory that has been set forth for literally several centuries. I mean, what happened to Jesus is, yes, he was scourged. Yes, he was beaten. Yes, they nailed him to a cross. Yes, it was really bad. But what actually happened is that Jesus went into a comatose state. And when they took him from the cross, they took his body and they carried it into the tomb. And when they set it on that rock inside the tomb, the cool air inside the tomb revived him. And Jesus actually never died. He simply came out, they saw him and said, look, he's alive again. See, the problem with that theory is that Romans were incredible at killing people. Romans could kill you better than any culture that had ever existed. Crucifixion was the most horrible form of death that there was. And of course, after they had nailed Jesus to the cross, when it was getting late in the day and they wanted to get the bodies down so that he wouldn't be on the cross over Passover, they went to make sure they were dead. And they would do that by breaking their legs. But when they came to Jesus, he was already dead. Now you say, but Leslie, he could have just looked dead. I guess so. But if you've ever seen someone dead, you usually know that they're dead. But the soldier wanted to make sure, and John 19 says one of the soldiers took a spear. And y'all, we're not talking about a prick. We're not talking about a soldier who was concerned, oh, we don't want to break the skin. You know, he won't look good at the funeral home. That's not what's going on. He takes a spear and goes up to Jesus and jabs it into his side. And John says blood and water came out. What is John saying? John's saying, folks, he was dead. I promise you, he was dead. A second theory that a lot of people come up with was that, well, the apostles did somehow steal the body. In fact, you turn over to Matthew chapter 27, and that's the text that literally Matthew talks about. Here's what the chief priest said to the soldiers. You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. You ever notice anything wrong with that statement? I had knee surgery this last week. I did. And let me tell you what I remember about that knee surgery. They carried me back to the operating room, and they put me on the operating table, and the doctor came in there, and they said, now, we want you to breathe real deep. And I breathed real deep in this thing right here, and they said, do it 2 more times. 1 more, real deep breath. And then you know what I know? They started cutting on my leg. I looked down there, and there the doctor was, boy, you're just cutting on my leg. And I thought, that kind of hurt. And then they started putting little things down in my knee and taking pictures up on a monitor. And I thought, those are nice pictures, you know. And then after that, he started kind of cleaning it up. And he said, all right, y'all, we're finished. And then close him up. And I'm sitting there thinking, boy, that was quick. Any of y'all believe in this story? If you are, I want to sell you some property in Mississippi, all right? Now, you see, what's funny about their excuse is while we were asleep. If you're asleep, guess what you don't know? You don't know that people are stealing a body. You don't know what's going on because you're asleep. And yet, and of course, they're like, wait a minute, that story's not going to hold water. And they says, well, if it gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble. You see, these guards knew what would happen if Pilate found out about this. And then they said, we're going to give you some money as well. And Matthew says this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. You know what would have happened if they had actually stolen the body of Jesus? You would have had guards scouring Jerusalem for Peter and Andrew and James and John. You would have had them arrested just as quickly as they could have been found. And the way the Romans were at getting information, it wouldn't have taken long to find out where his body was. This whole concept that they stole his body. And then explain to me how that 40 days later, Peter will stand back right in the middle of Jerusalem and say, listen, he didn't die and buried and stayed there. He died and was buried and has been raised again. And Peter said it with power and authority and with a lack of fear. And how would a man do that unless he really believed it? And then the third thing is the disciples simply saw a ghost. I don't know if you saw this week, but this week there's a new book that just came out. And the title of the book is The Sign, the Shroud of Turin and the Secret of the Resurrection. And supposedly this scientist has discovered that the image on the Shroud of Turin, do y'all know what that was? That image on the Shroud of Turin was where they wrapped the body of Jesus. This is what's interesting. He says the Shroud of Turin is real. It was the burial cloth of Jesus. He says, but what happened was they took it and they wrapped the body of Jesus, and as his body decomposed, it left an image on the cloth. That's what the image on the cloth is. I'd love to see someone try that. You ever watched a body decompose? I hope not a human body, but a body. You know, I mean, when they decompose, yeah, they'll mess up cloth all around it. But I promise you, they won't leave a faint image of a crucified man on it. I mean, this guy comes out on Easter with this new book. Why? Because he thinks I can make a little money on this one. And sadly, far too many Christians will help him out in that. You see, one of the things that's fascinating about this very story is that when you turn to Luke's gospel, when Luke begins to tell the stories about this, he literally brings that up. And he says, listen, look at my hands and my feet. It is myself. Touch me and see a ghost. I'm not a ghost. Touch me. I've got flesh and bones. Where's a piece of fish? I'll eat it in front of you. Here was a man that years later John would write, listen, we saw him and we touched him. He wasn't a ghost. So what happened? What happened? You know, you turn to the book of Job, and some scholars think Job's the oldest book of the Bible. Job seems to predate the time of Abraham. And Job in this book that is very ancient, and all scholars admit that, Job asks a very fundamental question. If a man dies, will he live again? There's the question. If a man dies, will he live again? And you know what? If you had asked Mary Magdalene that day, she would have said, maybe at the end of time, not today. If you'd sat down with Peter and said, if a man dies, will he live again? Maybe at the resurrection on the last day, but not today. If you had asked Pontius Pilate would have said, no. Man dies, that's the end of it. If you had asked Herod the Tetrarch, he would have said no. If you had asked the high priest would have said no. When you die, that's the end of it. But Jesus said, can I tell you something different? When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know. There's the word again, just spelled a little different. You will know. You will know that I am. And I've left the 3 dots up there for a reason, because that's really where the sentence kind of ends. Jesus saying, when I am lifted up, you will know that I am, the name for God in the Old Testament. And so Jesus says, you'll know all right. Fascinatingly, out of the book of Job, as Job is discussing that very issue, Job is looking at dying. He's pretty sure he's going to die. He wants to know, if I die and I'm buried, will I ever live again? And as Job is reflecting on that, Job says something that most of us don't realize. He says, I know. That's what he says. I know that my Redeemer lives. Did you know Job's the one that said that? I know that my Redeemer lives, and because He lives, I know what the future holds for me. We've sung songs based on that verse out of Job. Song entitled, I Know That My Redeemer Lives. Hugh, if you would, let's dim the lights. And I want to ask you, Diane, if we can, let's start this video. Very special
Who taught
video
the sun
based on this song.
where to stand in the morning? And who told the ocean you can only come this far? And who showed the moon where to hide till evening? Whose words alone can catch a falling star? Well, I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. All of creation testifies. This life within me cries. I know my Redeemer lives. The very same God who spins things in orbit runs to the weary, the worn, and the weak. And the same gentle hands that hold me when I'm broken, they conquer death to bring the victory. Well, I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. All of creation testifies. This life within me cries. I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. I know my Redeemer lives. All of creation testifies. This life within me cries. I know my Redeemer. He lives to take away my shame. He lives forever. I'll proclaim that the payment for my sin was the precious life He gave. But now He's alive and there's an my Redeemer lives.
John in Revelation chapter 1, writing many years later, has a vision that proclaimed the news of Resurrection Sunday. They did all that they could to seal that tomb. They made sure that there was a seal on the rock. They put guards all around the tomb to keep anybody from getting inside. And what they failed to realize is they didn't need to guard it from the outside. They needed to make sure that what was inside didn't get out. And that's what they were not able to do. Revelation proclaims the great news. I am the living one. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forever and ever. And I hold the keys of death and Hades. And I know that may not mean a lot to you, that last phrase, I hold the keys of death and Hades. But what Jesus is saying is that when I came out of that grave that Sunday morning 2,000 years ago, I took death off the table. I took Hades. You see, Hades is where we go when we die. It's where our spirit goes. And while a lot of people in the world think, oh, that's good, in the Bible, it's okay for now. But it's only in anticipation to the fact that one day we too will be raised again if we put our faith in Jesus Christ. And so Jesus came out with the keys of death and said, it will be no more. And the keys of Hades and said, it will be no more. Because through me, you too will have life if you follow me. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? We had hoped, the disciples say. We can hope because He lives. And if this morning you want to know the hope of the resurrection by becoming a follower of Jesus through faith and baptism, or by simply coming and saying, you know what, I've struggled, I've done in the past, I've committed my life to Jesus, but you know I've lost hope, you can reclaim that hope right now as together we stand and sing.
He rose with a mighty triumph for His foes.